Okay, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Good morning to our presenter, presenting from the US. This is our 128th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar, and it's a great pleasure to have Daniele Paserman from Boston University. And he is going to be presenting on loss aversion in teams, evidence from two-legged ties in European soccer. Daniele has the usual length of time, and I think he's quite happy to have a free-for-all. So if you have questions, feel free to simply ask them. No need to necessarily raise your hand. Without any further ado, Daniele, please do take away your talk.
Okay, so thank you very much. It's great that this is the 128th. 128th is a power of 2, and since we're talking about cup competitions, it seems very appropriate. So this is joint work with Andrea Vella, who I think he's here. He said he would try to attend. If he is, Andrea says hi. If not, he'll probably join in a little bit. Here he is. Hi, Andrea. Hi. Okay, so the paper is on loss aversion in teams and evidence from two-legged ties in European soccer. And I probably don't have to explain loss aversion. It's one of the key insights from behavioral economics that individuals, given a reference point, they feel sort of losses more prominently than gains. Okay, so this is one of the most widely cited papers in the social sciences, Kahneman and Tversky. And there's plenty of empirical evidence from both lab, the original Kahneman and Tversky, sort of many others, field settings in housing markets, financial markets, labor markets, and also work in in sports, showing that athletes suffer from loss aversion. Okay, so I'm hearing a little bit of an echo there. Yeah. Okay. So what we do in this paper, we try to ask, how does loss aversion interact with, incentives in contests, and can it be used to design better contests? And the specific setting that I'll be looking at is the context of European men's club soccer and cup competitions in club soccer. So we're going to focus on elimination rounds that are played in a home and home format. So there are 2 matches, one played at the home of team 1, the second one at the home of team 2. And what's interesting in elimination matches is that every tie ends with one team advancing and the other being eliminated. So this is a zero-sum game. It makes sort of some of the analysis a little bit easier about what the incentives are. And I would argue that this is it's an interesting context also because there's team decision making. Maybe this is debatable. Who is actually making the decision? Is it just the coach, or is everybody together? But it is a fluid context, which is a bit different than some of the other settings that have been studied in sports. It's not a sequence of individual decisions, and so maybe there's potential for groups to either attenuate or exacerbate individual biases. So the main finding of the first part of the paper is something that actually confirms what others had found previously, is that when the home team is trailing by 1 goal on aggregate relative to when the score is tied, there are more goals. Okay, and this is mostly driven by the team that is trailing, so the home team that scores more goals. Okay, and actually there's no difference in the goals scored by the away team. This pattern is stronger when teams are of similar strength, in ties that are high stakes, and in the final stages of the tie. And we're going to argue that this pattern of empirical findings is not consistent with traditional preferences, but can be rationalized by the presence of loss aversion. I'm going to explain in detail how we do that. Okay. And then, the second part of the paper, we ask, well, okay, given that there is loss aversion, and given that the structure of the contest is what it is, what can we say about the effect of the abolition of the away goal rule? Okay, so what is the away goal rule for those that may not be familiar with it? So the away goal rule was first set up in 1967 and lasted for more than 50 years. Essentially there are two matches. The team that scores the most goals advances, but what happens if there is a tie in the number of aggregate goals, which is not uncommon in soccer because it's a low-scoring game? Well, in that case, the team with the highest number of goals scored away from home advances to the next round. Okay, so the away goal rule, or AGR, was a somewhat controversial rule. Initially, people said, well, it would reward attacking play, but then people started to think about it. Well, does it really reward attacking play by the home team, rewards attacking play by the away team? Perhaps it's anachronistic. It was set up at a time when the home field advantage was much more prominent. Do we really need it anymore? And eventually, at the beginning of the 2021-2022 season, it was abolished. Okay, and so what is the effect of eliminating the away goal rule? And I'm going to argue that the first order effect that for some reason people have not paid too much attention to, perhaps because it's just so obvious, is that there are few ties. When you abolish the away goal rule, there are more ties that end in a tie, in a draw, right? So there's going to be more matches that are going to be decided on extra time and on penalties. And in fact, because of loss aversion, there's going to be an even larger effect than just a pure mechanical effect. Now, our structural estimation, we show that there's almost no effect on the total number of goals scored. But this results from a couple of competing forces. One, there is a moderate reduction in the number of goals scored in regular time, but it's compensated by the fact that there are more matches going to extra time, and in extra time, some goals are scored, and so there are more goals scored in extra time, so the total number of goals scored stays about the same. And then, one of the contributions of the paper, we're going to try to come up with a number of additional measures of how attractive a tie is, and we're going to define this more later. But we find little effect on what we call the excitement index, and again there's a little bit of a two competing forces. There's less excitement in regular time, but more excitement because of more extra time. There's going to be a large reduction in comebacks and big comebacks. So teams winning the tie, even though they had less than a 25% probability of winning at any point in the tie. And there's a moderate increase in the probability that the underdog wins the tie. Okay, so that's the preview of the results. Quickly, this paper is related to a number of strands in the literature. So I mentioned some papers, the paper by Pope and Dwitzer, which directly looks at loss aversion in professional golfers. There's a couple of papers that don't explicitly talk about loss aversion. Romer's famous paper on going it on fourth down. My own paper on tennis. They both show that players tend to be, or coaches tend to be, a little bit too conservative relative than what would be optimal. And there's a paper by Reade and co-authors that actually apply to soccer, and they say some of the patterns they observe in league games can be explained by by loss aversion. There's a strand of literature that looks at game state and goal scoring, so how goal scoring depends on the state of the match. Initial paper by Palomino and co-authors. Some of it's sort of theory, some of it sort of more empirically oriented. There's also some literature, which I think some people in this room may have contributed to, on two-legged competitions and the away goal rule. Again, both on the theoretical and the empirical side. And more broadly, this paper speaks to what is the optimal design of sporting context. Stefan's sort of seminal work. He's done a lot of this. A lot of that has sort of focused on the structure of leagues, but there's also a separate question about the structure of actual matches. And there's a very large literature on the uncertainty of outcomes hypothesis. So what types of features of individual contests make them attractive to audiences, and so this paper speaks to this as well. Okay, so what is our contribution relative to this literature? We're going to document game state effects on goal scoring rates. It's a new large sample. The incentives are well defined and unambiguous. These are knockout cup matches. There's no considerations in a league match that perhaps you want to settle for a draw. It doesn't make any sense in a cup match. And we're going to tie directly between these observed patterns and loss aversion. And that's, as I said, the first part of the paper. And then the second part of the paper, we're going to use this, structural approach. And, maybe I should put structural in quotation marks because it's a very sort of, soft touch structural, to estimate the effects of the AGR. And we can sort of, estimate directly what is the role of loss aversion thanks to this sort of, structural approach. And then, as I said, we're going to measure, estimate the effect of AGR on a wide variety of new measures of the attractiveness of a match. Okay. So that's the outline. We've gone through introduction. Let me go sort of briefly through the theory. This is actually very similar to work from Palomino et al. So just to make things really simple, I can start by thinking of a sort of one-period game. You can think of it, maybe the last period of a match. And I'm going to assume that teams can choose one of two strategies. They can either attack or defend. Okay, and it's a zero-sum game, so the payoffs for each team, without loss aversion, it's 1 if they win the game, -1 if they loses. And I assume that if a game is tied, then you go to penalty shootout, and that's just a flip of a coin. Each team wins with equal probability, so the expected payoff is 0. Okay. Now, one of 3 outcomes is possible in this game. Either team 1 scores, or with probability P1, which depends on the strategies chosen by the 2 teams, or team 2 scores with probability P2, or neither of the teams scores. Okay. So, those are the 3 possible outcomes at, this particular instant of the game. I'm going to make 4 assumptions, which I think are pretty uncontroversial. Or, the first one is controversial, actually. It's completely obviously not true. Teams are not equal strength. But, to simplify, I'm going to, start by analyzing a case where, you have 2 teams that are identical. So if they play the same strategy, the goal scoring probabilities are identical. Symmetry says, again, this sort of follows from this equal strength assumption. It means that, the probability of team 1 scoring when it attacks and team 2 defends is equal to the probability that team 2 scores when team 2 defends and team 2 attacks and team 2 defends. So that's, I think, uncontroversial. And then we have these sort of 2 additional assumptions. One is that attack create goals. So given the strategy chosen by your opponent, if you attack, you're more likely to score. And defense prevents goals. Okay, so again, given the strategy by your opponent, if you defend, it's more difficult for your opponent to score. What I have left unspecified is what happens when, one team attacks and the other team defends, who scores more goals. So what is the relationship between P1 AD and P2 AD? And I'm going to allow both possibilities. The attack beats defense possibility, so that P1 AD is greater than P2 AD, so that team 1 has a higher probability of scoring when it attacks and the opponent's defense. So sometimes, I'll jokingly call it the Jogo Bonito assumption. And, both the authors here are Italian, so we are perhaps biased towards the other assumption, which is the Catenaccio assumption that defense beats attacks. Okay, so when, team 1 attacks and team 2 defends, team 2 is actually, more likely to score because, it can, play on the counter and has more spaces and can score. Okay, but, we're not making any specific claims about which one of those 2 things, holds. Okay, so one can derive 2 propositions. The first one is, completely straightforward. If team 1 is leading, the optimal strategy is for team 1 to defend and for team 2 to attack. I don't think that's sort of very surprising. You're leading. It's the last stage of the game. You want to defend your lead, and the other team is trailing. They have to attack. Okay, so that's obvious, and it follows directly from the assumptions. Proposition 2 is slightly more interesting. If the score is tied, then the unique equilibrium in dominant strategies depends on that assumption whether defense beats attack or attack beats defense. Okay, and if defense beats attack, the equilibrium is for both teams to defend, and if attack beats defense, the equilibrium is for both teams to attack. Okay, so this was actually proven by Palomino et al. And same result. Okay, so what are the empirical implications of this? Is that there's basically sort of a joint prediction here. Okay, so if the number of goals when the score is tied is lower than when one team is leading, okay, it means that the teams are playing defensively, then it also has to be the case that when one team is leading and therefore it's defending, it should be more likely to score goals than the team that is attacking. Okay, so if there are fewer goals when the score is tied, then when the score is not tied, the leading team should actually be more likely to score. On the other hand, if there are more goals when the score is tied because both teams attack, then the trailing team is more likely to score when it's trailing, okay? Because, attack beats defense, okay? And in practice, that's not what happens, okay? So in practice, there are fewer goals are scored when the score is tied than when one team is leading. I'm going to show you the empirical evidence in a little bit. But when one team is trailing, that team is more likely to score than the leading team, okay? So the data, this simple observation, this is not consistent with the simple theoretical model, but the results can be reconciled if we assume loss aversion. Okay, so what do we mean by loss aversion? Losses relative to a reference point are valued more than gains. So the payoff for team 1 when the score is tied, well, if it scores, it gets a gain of 1. If nothing happens, it remains at 0. But if it concedes a goal, it doesn't lose 1, but it loses 1 plus alpha. Okay, that's what sort of loss aversion means. Okay, and with loss aversion, you obtain this result. It's still true that when one team is leading, the equilibrium is still dA. When team 1 leads, it's still optimal for team 1 to defend and for team 2 to attack. However, it's no longer true that the equilibrium when the score is tied is determined uniquely by this inequality between P1 AD and P2 AD, okay? And you can have situations where the equilibrium is for both teams to defend, even though attack beats defense, okay? So even though, you're more likely to score when you attack, but when the score is tied, if you're loss averse, both teams will choose to defend, okay? So this, rationalizes the empirical findings, and there's actually not particularly difficult, to prove that. Okay, so now we can extend this model, and this is actually, the Palomino et al. Contribution. Instead of just a single period, extended to multiple period, and they have this very nice result that if the score is tied, the equilibrium is always symmetric, either DD or AA, depending on whether defense beats attack or attack beats defense, and that's true at every period of the game, not just the last period. And what they show is that close to the end of the game, as in our period, the equilibrium is for the team that leads to defend and the team that trails to attack. But if you go sort of sufficiently behind, earlier in the game, it's possible, if attack beats defense, that you still have an incentive to attack, that you want to build up a bigger lead. Okay. Now, loss aversion doesn't sort of modify those general conclusions. You can still have many different types of equilibria. including, that both teams attack when the score, is that right? I'm not sure that's right. Okay, maybe that's a typo. When the score is tied, but it doesn't change sort of the basic conclusion. So even with multiple periods, I think that that basic observation about this sort of inconsistency about what happens when the score is tied versus when one team attack and the other defends. What about teams that are not equal ability, and unequal ability could be because of the players have different skills, or there's home field advantage, or something else. And here it depends on how exactly we model individual differences in ability. If we just assume that the higher ability team just has a higher probability of scoring by that the probability of scoring it increases by a constant amount for every strategy pair, then obviously nothing changes because you're just adding a constant to all of the matrix, so nothing changes. And if you don't make that assumption, if you make these sort of goal scoring probabilities depend on the strategy chosen, you can basically get anything. So in a sense, from a theoretical point of view, it's perhaps not super interesting because you can basically get any prediction that you like. In practice, what we do in the empirical analysis, we're going to try to control as much as possible for ability differences, so that we are thinking of teams that are we're smoothing out these sort of individual differences. Okay, so a little bit about European club soccer. It's structured around national leagues that typically have a round robin format, and European Cup competitions. In recent years, the Champions League and the Europa League, and even more recent years, the Europa Conference League. And both these competitions are characterized by an elimination format, so a straight knockout in the preliminary rounds. Then there's a group stage, and then there's a final stage, the quarterfinals, the semifinals that are with a straight knockout. And all the elimination rounds, with the exception of the final, are based on 2 legs, with each team playing at home once. So the team with the highest number of goals over the 2 ties advances to the next round. Prior to 2021, the away goal rule held. And so, this is a good setting to test the theory because there are clear incentives to win, to advance to the next round, and, there's no point in settling. Okay, so what is our data? So we collected data for, all 2-legged ties in the 2 major European competitions, the Champions League and the Europa League, formerly known as the UEFA Cup. We stopped the data collection so we collected the data around 2018. That's why we stopped it then. We went back to about 2003. That's when sort of the Champions League, changed its format. We could collect, data, even further behind, but, this is relatively recent data. What's important is that we're looking at both the preliminary stages from 2009 onwards and the knockout routes. So we have more than 2,500 2-legged ties. So for each tie, we have data on all the goals scored and the minute in which they were scored. And so we construct a minute-by-minute panel with the current score, the current number of away goals, and whether a goal was scored in minute t. And that's going to be our main sort of analysis sample. And for additional data, we collected data from Club ELO, which is a good approximation to the relative strength of the 2 clubs at the beginning of the tie. I just learned this week from James that it's not quite as good as wages or, bookmaker odds, but it's pretty good. Is that right, James?
Something like that.
All right. So here are sort of some summary statistics on goals. Some things that I want to highlight here. Total goals in the tie about 5.2. Team 2 scores a little bit more than Team 1. This is for a couple of reasons. One, in some of these ties Team 1 is the team that plays at home in the first leg. Team 2 is the team that plays away in the first leg and therefore at home in the second leg. So in some of these ties, there were seeding. So Team 2 was actually better, because they finished the group stage in a higher position. So that in part explains why team 2 scores then more than team 1. There's actually a little bit of literature trying to explain sort of beyond seeding why there's an advantage to playing the second leg at home, and perhaps the home advantage of playing the return leg at home is larger than the home advantage of playing the first leg at home, and that could also explain why team 2 scores more than team 1. A lot more goals at home than away. There's actually more goals in leg 2. And one thing that I want to emphasize here, so if you look at the number of goals scored in extra time, it's about 0.8 per match. And the number of goals scored in leg 2 in the 90 minutes is about 2.7. So extra time is 30 minutes. The regular match is 90 minutes. So it's less than a third. So the goal scoring rate per minute in extra time is lower than the goal scoring rate per minute in regular time. And there are a couple of a few explanations. One, it could be that teams are just tired and they can't convert chances very well. It could be that matches that go into extra time feature more balanced teams, and there are fewer goals in more balanced ties. But it could also be loss aversion, right? That is sort of consistent, that the teams are now really sort of wary about attacking too much when the score is tied, and if they concede, the match will the chances of them winning the tie decreases. So that is a possibility. Okay, so here is some graphs. I hope you can see it. Do I need to zoom in a little bit? I'll keep it like this. Okay, so so the first graph here on the top left, it shows just the goal scoring rate of either of the two teams. Okay, and you see here this sort of inverse U-shape. Sorry, a U-shape, not inverse U-shape. There are fewer goals when the score is tied than when one team is leading. Again, this is not controlling for ability differences, so it could be that these ties where one team is leading by 3 goals, or the home team is leading by 3 goals, or it's trailing by 3 goals. There are a lot more goals because just the home team is a lot better or a lot worse than the away team. But there's this clear valley, like there's this clear sort of U-shaped relationship. Okay, what's interesting is look separately at the goals of home and away teams. So the red bars here are the goals scored by the away teams. This tends to decline monotonically, which again, I think it reflects mostly ability differences. But if you look at the goals scored by the home team, the relationship is not monotonic. Okay, so home teams score a little bit more when they're trailing by 1 goal than when the score is tied. Okay, and that also shows up in the goal difference, that the home team scores more when the score is tied than than when it's trailing by 1 goal. So this is the goal difference in favor of the home team. The home team scores more when it's trailing by 1 goal than when the score is tied. Okay, so this is sort of the first evidence, consistent with what I was telling you before. Okay, so let's do it a little bit more sophisticated. We do regression analysis. Our outcome variables are whether any team scores a goal scored by home team, a goal scored by the away team in tie I at minute T. And we're going to use sort of the series of dummies for what the score is, the advantage of the home team is. So it's going to have sort of positive values if the home team is leading, or negative values if taking into account the away goal rule. Okay, so if both teams have scored the equal number of goals, but team 1 has scored 1 more away goal, then team 1 would be considered that it's leading in the tie. Okay, and we have some additional control variables. So again, these ELO ratings of the two teams, and dummies for 15-minute intervals within the tie to capture fatigue effects, or studying the opposition effect in the beginning of the tie, year dummies, competition dummies, and round dummies, and standard errors are clustered at the tie. Okay, so this is just what happens on the goal scoring rate. So as I move from column 1 to column 4, I'm progressively adding more controls. So column 1 is just reproducing those histograms that I was showing before, or sorry, those bar graphs that I was showing before. So you see that there's more goals relative to the baseline, which is the teams are tied. There are more goals both when the home team is trailing by 1 goal and when it's leading by 1 goal. This is not controlling for anything. Part of it is due to when the goals are scored. Of course, there's not many goals scored at the very beginning of ties, more goals scored towards the end of ties. So these differences become smaller. And specification 3, this is already pretty much the main thing. So now we're controlling for ELO rating. So we're controlling for the ability of the 2 teams, and you still find that the team, if the home team is trailing by 1 goal, it scores more goals. Sorry, if the home team is trailing by 1 goal, there are more goals in the tie scored by either of the 2 teams than when the baseline category, that is when the score is tied. Okay, and our main specification, we include the season and round fixed effects, and it doesn't really change very much. Okay. Okay, so the goal scoring rate when the home team trails by 1 goal, significantly higher than when the score is tied. The magnitude of the effect is, these are small numbers, about 0.17 percentage points relative to a baseline of 2.5 percentage points. So it's about 6.5% of the mean. And the results are robust to the inclusion of all these controls. When the home team leads by 1 goal, there is no statistically significant difference in the goal scoring rate relative to the tied game once the controls are included. Okay. So now let's look at the other outcomes. So column 1 now just reproduces column 4 from the previous table. And now let's look at the outcomes, just goals scored by the home team, goals scored by the away team, and the goal difference. And the main result, and also the only one that's really sort of interestingly statistically significant here, is that when the home team is trailing, it scores more goals relative to when the score is tied. We don't see a symmetric effect for the away team, okay, which is not entirely consistent with our theory. We do see goal difference that goes in the right direction. This is not statistically significant at conventional levels. So summary of the previous table: almost all of the increase in the goal scoring rate comes from the home team. That's about a 10% increase relative to the mean. There's no increased scoring by the away team when it leads by 1 goal or trails by 1 goal relative to tied score. And the goal difference, so the increase in the home team's goal difference when trailing by 1 goal relative to when the score is tied, it's a fairly large effect, but statistically insignificant. So that coefficient was about 30% of the sample mean. And again, I would argue that the results are, at least for the home team, they're consistent with this theoretical model that attack beats defense. So you're actually more productive at scoring goals when you attack and the other team defends. But there's also loss aversion. So we've done sort of some robustness. What if we restrict attention just to the last period of the game? So it could be the last 45 minutes or the last 15 minutes of the tie, plus extra time. The effect is the same or larger than the whole sample, but less precisely estimated. Including, we get, when we look at the last 15 minutes, we get result on the goal difference also for the away team, but it's not statistically significant, so I'm not going to make a whole deal about that. The results are more pronounced in ties between equally matched teams. Okay, so I define that at teams that have an ELO rating difference which is less than 100 points. So you can think of it, the ex ante probability of qualification is, between 45 and 55%. And this is, I think this is, is supportive of the model because it's a cleaner sample when we're just looking at equally matched teams. And we find results that are more pronounced in higher stake ties, so the knockout stages of the competition, not so much the preliminaries. Okay, so perhaps this says that loss aversion is more likely when the stakes are high. Okay. So that was the first part of the paper, and I'm about halfway, so that's good timing, I'd say. Now, how does this interact with the away goal rule? Okay, so probably I don't need to tell this to people in this group, but what do economists do? So economists, one of the things that they do, well, they try to think of rules of the market or the economic environment that takes into account the agent's incentives and their behavioral responses to these incentives in order to maximize some objective function. Okay, so maybe they want to maximize social welfare, or designing auctions. So how do you design the auctioneer's revenue? A lot of different objectives. And the sports economists, perhaps one of the objectives is to design the rules of the sports contest that takes into account the agent's incentives and their behavioral responses, and maximize some objective function. Okay, and the question is, what is the objective function? Maybe it's attractiveness to the audience, maybe it's fairness, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and so in the context of the European Cup competitions, this paper speaks, what is the optimal ways to break ties? So let's go back to the away goal rule again, now with a little bit more examples. Again, in the case of a tie in the number of aggregate goals, the team with the highest number of goals scored away from home advances to the next round. So here is one example, relatively recent. This is the UEFA Champions League quarterfinal 2018-2019 season between two English teams, Tottenham Hotspur and Manchester City. Tottenham won the first leg 1-0. And the second leg, Manchester City won 4-3. Okay, so the aggregate score was 4-4. So it's a tie, but Tottenham advanced because it scored more goals away from home. So it scored 3 goals away from home relative to 0 goals away from home scored by Manchester City. Okay, so that's how the the away goal rule works, and this is has been in place in European competitions for 50 years. Okay, so there was a lot of debate about the the away goal rule. It often came up after ties like this in which one team was eliminated because of the away goal rule, and they started complaining, oh, the away goal rule is terrible. And people said, well, okay, but maybe there are some advantages of the away goal rule. Maybe we want to reward attacking play by the away team. Sometimes people mischaracterize the away goal rule as away goal rule count double, which is not exactly correct. But if they count double, then you want to attack more. But there are also various cons, and a lot of the debate says, well, it's true that the away team has an incentive to attack, but then the home team has an incentive to defend. They don't want to concede an away goal to the opponent, so they're going to play more cautiously. So there are going to be fewer goals. The criterion for selecting the winner is arbitrary. There's nothing really special about away goals. Perhaps it's unfair that the away team has 30 more minutes to score an away goal in extra time than in the return leg. So that maybe is not desirable, and this is something that is often mentioned. Maybe what's unfair is not that the away team has 30 more minutes to score an away goal, is that the home team has 30 more minutes in extra time to score a goal at home in front of their home crowd. So that's also unfair. And another complaint was, look, this away goal rule was perhaps designed in the 1960s when home field advantage was really significant because travel was much more difficult, and accommodations were difficult, and home teams would flood the pitch and whatnot to gain a home field advantage. And the away goal rule was meant to sort of balance this. But it's no longer necessary today when the away field advantage still exists, but it's much less significant. Okay. So I don't know if you can see these, but these are actually some of the reports in the media when the rule was eventually abolished. So this is June 2021. I would say pretty much in the middle of night, like nobody. I mean, people sort of had anticipated, but it happened very suddenly. And, UEFA President Alexander Ceferin explained, the impact of the rule now runs counter to its original purpose, as in fact it now dissuades the home team, especially in the first legs, from attacking, because they fear conceding a goal would give their opponent a crucial advantage. Okay, so this, one of the arguments that I put up before, that, you play more cautiously because you don't want to concede away goals. And, UEFA's official tweet says, look, statistics since the mid-1970s show a clear trend of continuous reduction in the gap between the number of home-away wins. So they're saying, look, we don't really need it anymore. It was meant to sort of, counterbalance the advantage of the home team. So the home team advantage is not so prominent anymore. We can get rid of the away goal rule. Okay. So I'm going to argue that most of these arguments are a little bit muddy and not perhaps, very, very solid. And the main thing that, even when I started doing this, and, now that I've done it, it seems like completely obvious, but even when we started working on this thing, I hadn't thought about it. The first order effect of the away goal rule is that it breaks ties. And so there are going to be fewer ties. And so it reduces the likelihood that an alternative tiebreaker is needed to determine the winner. Okay, so you're going to have, with the away goal rule, fewer ties that go to extra time and fewer ties that go to penalties. Okay, so taking that into account, what are the pros and cons of the away goal rule, like an updated version? So the pros of the away goal rule is that you have less needs for extra time. Perhaps this is better for TV scheduling. You know exactly how long the match is going to last. Perhaps you care about fatigue of players, of workers, of fans. That could be sort of one reason why you want less extra time. The alternative to the away goal rule is that you're going to increase the number of ties decided by penalty kicks, which perhaps that's also unfair. That's not exactly, the nature of soccer. It's a very sort of, specific way of settling ties. A couple of additional things is that, because you're breaking ties in a somewhat arbitrary manner, you're actually giving a little bit of an advantage to the underdog. Okay, and perhaps that's something that you think is desirable. And finally, and this I'm going to explain in a second, you're going to get a larger swing in the game win probability. Okay, and people have used this to as a measure of excitement. Okay, so if goals are exciting, people like goals in football because they swing the probability of who wins the match. Okay, and so more goals are great, but more goals are great in a 4-3 tie. More goals are not great if one team wins 7-0. Okay, nobody cares about having 7 goals or 7-0 or 8-0 wins. Okay, what are the pros of abolishing the away goal rule? Well, one thing is that we're going to have more football, okay, or soccer. So there's going to be more extra time. More action. You're going to have more breaks for putting in TV ads. So maybe that's the real reason why UEFA decided to abolish the away goal rule, even if they didn't know it. You could argue that maybe you don't want unpredictability. You want the favorites to advance. And again, maybe UEFA wants to make sure that the big strong teams are protected and they don't break off to make their own Super League. And so you want to reduce unpredictability. And you could just say that, extra time and penalties are actually more exciting. And so we want more of that. Just to add one more bullet point is that, with more extra time and penalty, that also rewards team with, deeper rosters and, deeper benches, which again is probably teams that, are, richer and, more well-resourced. Okay. Now, how does sort of loss aversion tie into this? So without the away goal rule, there are going to be more game states in which the tie is tied. And, given loss aversion, that means that there's going to be less incentive to attack. So there's going to be fewer goals in regular time, but because there's a higher likelihood of goals going to extra time, there are going to be more goals. So the effect is potentially. Okay, so what do we do in this part of the paper? Again, we're going to do this structural evaluation of the away goal rule. again, structural in quotation marks if you prefer. I'm going to estimate a slightly modified version of the reduced form model. So instead of looking at goals scored separately by the home and away team, I just estimate a multinomial logit for each one of the three events. Is there a goal by team 1, team 2, or no goal at every minute of the game? Conditional on team 1 and team 2's ability, conditional on the time played in the match, and conditional on the game state. Okay. The key assumption for implementing this structural model is that the only thing that matters for scoring is the current game state. Okay, so by how many goals does the home team lead at the current minute? So not the away goals, not the probability of qualification. Okay, so the argument that Alexander Ceferin made in that statement was, look, perhaps if I'm leading 1-0 in leg 1 or I'm leading 2-1, my behavior is not the same. Okay, and that is sort of assumed away in this context. Okay, so I don't allow that. Okay, but once I know what is the probability of scoring given the game state, I can simulate matches given those estimated probabilities with and without the away goal. Okay, and I do it 10,000 times and then look at various outcomes and see how they vary with and without the away goal. Okay, so some of the outcomes I'm going to look at, whether the game goes to extra time, whether it goes to penalty kicks, who qualifies, some goal outcomes, so the total goals scored by each team, the number of away goals, the number of goals scored in leg 1, leg 2, total, regular time, extra time. And then I have these attractiveness outcomes, excitement, comeback, underdog, and uncertainty. I'm going to explain them in a little bit. Okay, so for every simulated tie, we can calculate at every minute the probability that each team qualifies. Okay, so we can call this the win probability, given the game state, the team abilities, and whether the away goal rule is on or off. Okay, and I'd argue that these game win probabilities are key ingredients for measures of attractiveness. Now, in American sports, they have become very popular in recent years. So here are a couple of examples. I don't know how many of you follow March Madness. This is a game just last week, unbelievable game between Gonzaga and UCLA. This is a basketball game, and you see that the game win probability moved a lot during the game. So initially UCLA had a high chance of winning, and then Gonzaga came back, and then UCLA almost came back and won at the very last second, and then eventually Gonzaga won. I think that's what happened. This is from the Super Bowl. I'm from Boston, so I had to put in something on New England Patriots. Okay. So excitement index. This is a cumulative change in the qualification probability of team 1 from the beginning to the end of the tie. And I'm taking a lot of these measures from work by this, I guess is a blogger, a basketball blogger, Mike Buoy. So he wrote something in 538 as well about it. So here are a couple of exciting ties. Let me start with this one. Okay, so this is Manchester City versus Monaco in the 2016-2017 Champions League. Manchester City won the first leg 5-3. Monaco won the second leg 3-1. So the aggregate score was 6-6, and Monaco advanced on the away goal rule. Okay, so why is this an exciting tie? Well, there are a lot of goals, so there are a lot of swings in win probability. There are also the sequence of goals is, first Manchester City scored, then, Monaco scored 2 goals, then Manchester City, scored again, then, so there's a lot of swings. It goes back and forth. Okay, so this makes the tie exciting. Okay, and notice that this graph shows this, this win probability under the 2 scenarios, like, with and without the away goal. So look at, for example, what happens towards the end of the tie. So with the away goal rule, at this point, after the Fabinho goal, Monaco is leading. Okay, so as the end of the tie increases, their probability of qualifying increases. So on the vertical axis of the probability that Manchester City qualifies. Okay, then Manchester City scores. This has a big swing in win probability. Like we're about 10 minutes towards the end of the tie. And maybe 20 minutes, Manchester City scores. This changes their qualifying probability from about 20% to about 80%. So that's a big swing in win probability. Okay, then Monaco scores again a few minutes later, and another very big swing in win probability. Okay, and now because they are, they have the away goal advantage, as you approach the end of the game, their probability goes to 1. Okay, now without the away goal rule, these swings in win probability are more muted. Okay, because now the game is tied. Okay, so here the probability of qualifying of each team is about 50%. And it goes from 50% to 80% and then back to 50%. Okay, so you have fewer swings in win probability in this specific example with the away goal. Okay, it can also go in the other direction, but I don't have an example for that. Oops. Okay, another exciting tie. Probably a lot of you remember this. Barcelona versus Paris Saint-Germain, or Paris Saint-Germain versus Barcelona. Paris Saint-Germain won the first leg 4-0. And everybody thought, okay, that's the end of it. Look how close to 1 their win probability is. And then, Barcelona scored 3 goals in the beginning of the second leg. So now it was 4-3 on aggregate. And then, PSG scored again. So now this is about, 20 minutes from the end of the match. Barcelona needed 3 goals to qualify. And they got these 3 goals in the last, 3 minutes. Okay. And so you have this massive change in win probability. This is a big comeback. Okay. So at this point, PSG's probability of qualifying was about 1. By the end of the match, it's 0. Okay. Barcelona had this, huge comeback. I should have predicted. Let me give you a couple of not so exciting ties. You maybe don't remember this tie, even though it's also a few years ago. PSV Eindhoven against Atletico Madrid, 0-0, so 0-0 in both legs. So nothing much happened. Notice that the win probability creeps up from about 20% to about 50%. So it's not completely flat, but this is not a particularly exciting tie. And I want to show another unexciting tie. This is a match between Schalke and Real Madrid. Notice that at the beginning of the tie, Schalke was, the underdog. They only had about a 20% probability of qualifying. Real Madrid went up 2-0 within half an hour, and then they added 2 more early in the second half. And then there were a lot of other goals. Okay, so there are a lot of goals in this tie. There are 11 goals. That's sort of way in the upper tail of the distribution of goals in the tie, in our sample. But this is, one of the least exciting ties. Okay, so number of goals, correlates only weakly with the excitement index. Okay, so the correlation of the excitement index with the number of goals is only 0.50. Okay, so that's excitement. Comeback index is just basically how large of a comeback there was. So it's 1 minus the lowest possible probability of qualification of the team that eventually qualified. The underdog index is, measures how likely or, how much, the underdog qualifies. So it's 1 minus the starting qualifying probability of the team that eventually qualifies. And, the uncertainty index says, look, perhaps I don't like a lot of swing in wins probability, but I like ties that are very, where the win probability is very close to 50% all the time. Okay, so where you really are uncertain about who qualifies. Okay, so here are some data. This is from the actual data. This is from the sample. Okay, so all the matches here are played under the away goal rule. About 6.6% of ties go to extra time. 3% of ties go to penalty kicks, but 15% of ties have both teams with the same number of goals after 180 minutes. Okay? Out of these 15% of times, about 9% are settled by the away goal rule. Okay? So without any behavioral differences, instead of 6%, without any behavioral responses, instead of 6% of ties going to extra time, you'd have 15% of ties going to extra time. These are some of my attractiveness measures. So I calculate both these indices that I described before. I also calculate some binary versions. So like a roller coaster is a tie where the excitement index is greater than 2. And that's about 5% of the sample, and similar for the other measures. Okay. So I just said that. Okay. So this is already the result of my structural simulation. So how do I read this table? These are just the tie outcomes. In my simulated data, I have 7% of ties going to extra time, so a little bit higher than the actual data. Without the away goal rule, that number goes up to 15.7%, so an increase of 8.8%. So almost, actually more than doubling of the number of ties that go to extra time. The number of ties that go to penalty kicks, it goes up from 3% to about 8.4%. Here is something that's interesting that people had highlighted already before. We know that Team 2 qualifies. Again, this is just qualification before penalty kicks. Slightly more than Team 1. This is in part because of these quality differences between Team 2 and Team 1, but also because of this additional advantage of playing the return leg at home. Now, the issue with extra time, remember that we said there are these two competing forces, that the away team, their goals count double, but the home team has 30 more minutes in extra time to play in front of the home fans. I think in a completely serendipitous manner, these two forces tended to exactly balance each other. And if you simulate the probability of Team 1 or Team 2 qualifying, given the away goal rule in extra time, it's almost exactly 50%. When you abolish the away goal rule, you take away the advantage of the away team, you keep the advantage of the home team, and you see that there's a big drop in the probability of qualifying of the away team. Okay. And this is, people had found this result, that when you eliminate the probability that Team 1 qualifies, sorry, when you eliminate the away goal rule, the probability that Team 1, so the team playing away in the second leg, qualifies goes down. Okay, what happens to goals? I would argue almost nothing. Okay, so the mean number of goals in a tie is like 5.19 versus 5.18. So a difference of like 0.01 goal. That's really tiny. The only thing where there's a little bit of action is what happens in leg 2. What happens to the distribution of goals in leg 2? And there's a slight decrease in the number of goals in leg 2, about 0.06 fewer goals during the 90 minutes. But because more ties go to extra time, there are more goals in extra time, obviously, and this is somewhat sizable effect. Okay, so no effect on total goals, away goals in leg 1, but there are fewer goals in the 90 minutes, more extra time, and more goals in extra time. What about our excitement indices? And I guess maybe this table is a little bit too crowded. I think in terms of excitement, again, I think it's pretty much nothing. Okay, so abolishing the away goal rule doesn't really do much to excitement. It does decrease a little bit excitement during the first 180 minutes. Okay, and again, because there are more states in which the match is tied and so fewer goals, but that is counterbalanced by playing 30 more minutes. In those 30 more minutes, you have more goals. That's exciting. And so overall, the excitement index is pretty much ineffective. this is not super surprising. So this is, I would say, is a fairly large effect on what I call the comeback index. And we saw that before. Like, when the away goal rule, you can have one goal that changes the qualification probability from 0 to 1. Okay, so it's not surprising that you can have, it's much more likely that you have big comebacks with the away goal rule than without the away goal rule. There is something of effect on the underdog index. So underdogs are slightly disfavored. I don't find much of an effect on just like, do big underdogs qualify? So teams that have, say, less than a 25% probability of qualifying ex ante. And, with the away goal rule, there are more states of the game in which the probability of qualifying is close to 50%. And so there's a little bit of an increase in the uncertainty index here, sort of a decrease in the uncertainty index, meaning that there's more uncertainty in the tie. Okay, so I just said that, and I'm about to run out of time, but I'm almost finished. One thing that's important is that some of the effects are just mechanical, right? Because tied games go to extra time, you're going to have more extra time and everything that is associated with that. But part of that is this behavioral response that you score fewer goals when the tie is tied because of loss aversion. Okay, so how do I assess the importance of the behavioral factor? I'm going to re-estimate the model by shutting down the behavioral factor. Okay, so I basically estimate the model, assuming that goal scoring rates do not depend on the game state. Okay, they just depend on team abilities. Okay, so that's just, when you introduce the away goal rule, you still have more ties going to extra time, but there is no change in goal scoring rates. Okay, and so the first three columns, this is the total effect. That's just sort of reproduces the numbers that I had in the previous table. And the next three columns is this mechanical effect. Okay, now the baseline is slightly different. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I need to have just run these simulations for longer. But notice that there is this additional behavioral effect. Okay, so you get an 8 percentage point versus about 9 percentage point in the increase in the probability of extra time, and that sort of extra 1 percentage point is a behavioral effect. For penalty kicks, it's even more pronounced. Okay, so you get a the total increase is about 5 percentage points, but almost 20% of that is due to a behavioral effect. What's interesting here is the total goals. Okay, so you would think that abolishing the AGR effect, the effect is not large. Okay, but if there were only a mechanical effect, you say, hey, look, we're going to have more extra time. There's going to be a little bit of an increase in the number of goals from 5.2 to 5.3 per match. But if you do include the behavioral effect, that thing goes away. And I don't think I have too much to say about these differences. There are some, but they're mostly quite small. I guess the only one is this excitement index that makes a little bit of it. Okay, one last thing. The away goal rule was eventually abolished in 2021, 2022. So what this graph shows is, the in-sample predictions of our model, okay, and the actual fraction of ties that go to extra time every season, okay, and the red line is the ties that go to penalties, okay, and this is our out-of-sample predictions. Okay, so the dashed line is the out-of-sample predictions, and the dotted lines here are what actually happened in the last two seasons. I omitted 2020-21. That's sort of the COVID-affected season. It's a little bit different. I also omitted the last, the end of the 1920 season because we didn't collect the data, even though we should have. So the model sort of gets it right. In fact, it may even sort of underestimate the fraction of ties that go to penalty kicks and extra time. I wouldn't make too much of these sort of year-to-year fluctuations. This is, our predictions on number of goals. I have to figure out what happens here at the beginning of the sample. This shouldn't be quite like this, but it is. And we're pretty much well calibrated in terms of the out-sample predictions for number of goals. So that's the end. So conclusion: large sample of European two-legged ties. We find that more goals are scored when one team is trailing than when the score is tied, and this is driven by goals scored by the home team. And we can rationalize these patterns by a simple game theoretic model with loss aversion. Okay, so you need to augment, add loss aversion to it. And then we're going to use the implied parameters to estimate structurally the effect of the abolition of the away goal rule. The first order effect is that you have more extra time and more penalties. No effect on goals scored, but slightly fewer goals in the second leg, 90 minutes, but more goals scored in second leg extra time. No effect on the overall excitement index. You do have fewer comebacks, and the underdogs are slightly penalized when you abolish the away goal rule. So thank you very much. And sorry for going slightly over time.
Not a problem, Daniele. Thank you very much for a really interesting, fascinating talk. We have time for questions and comments. So if anyone does have a question or comment, please do raise your hand and we can get going with the Q&A. One thing I was thinking while you were presenting, Daniele, is that there was one slight quirk in the away goals extra time thing, because I think it was the League Cup in England where it went to extra time at 90 minutes, not based on away goals, but away goals then counted after 120 minutes rather than 90 minutes. I couldn't find details of exactly when that changed, but I know there were some competitions where you had a slight quirk.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that we could, consider as sort of other quirks. So one is, what if you have the away goal rule only in extra time? The other are even sort of more creative ways to settle ties, and this has come up. What if you play penalties before extra time? Yeah. And actually, this is based on our findings that would say you're going to have more exciting extra time, because then one team is forced to attack, the other is forced to defend. And if you have this sort of loss aversion, you don't have that both teams play super cautiously in extra time, so to prevent goals. So we could include those things. And again, I started by saying that the away goal rule is a bit anachronistic. Perhaps our study is a little bit anachronistic, because I don't really think that UEFA is considering reintroducing the away goal rule, but maybe they're going to think about additional things.
Okay, questions and comments from the audience? Jean-Louis.
You hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation. I just want to point out regarding the number of goals scored during extra time that you said it's a little bit less. It's less than 1/3 as compared to regular time. I found the same for the World Cup. Remember when I made my presentation in December, I found about 0.3 number of goals scored, 0.3% as compared to 1/3. So it was the same as you. Probably fatigue is influencing, is explaining this reduction of the number of goals scored.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's I started attending Roses in January, so I missed your presentation, which I'm sure was super interesting. But I'll make sure.
It was the same. So
I think that if you just look at the aggregate, there is this combination of at least three forces. There's fatigue. There's the fact that a match that goes into extra time, probably the teams are relatively balanced, and I think part of it could be sort of loss aversion and adopting a more cautious strategy.
Thanks.
Thanks, John Louis. And of course, you can access John Louis' talk via the YouTube channel, Daniele, should you want to catch up.
I definitely will.
More questions and comments from anyone? I guess one thing that's sprung to mind for me with your early kind of theoretical model, Daniele, was the assumption of equal strengths must have an impact on that optimal strategy of being defensive versus being attacking when your opponent is being defensive or attacking. I don't know. I mean, I kind of think that if you're a weaker team, you might decide not to. I don't know. Perhaps you would. I don't know. In terms of your strategy, you're a weaker team. The classic thing in football, isn't it, that you get one goal and you hold on to that one goal because you can in football because it's such a low-scoring sport.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you've experimented with relaxing that at some point. It makes things too complicated.
I think that probably a common empirical observation is that when you have two teams of unequal strength, even when the score is tied at the beginning of the game, the stronger team attacks and the weaker team defends. Okay, and which suggests that those probabilities of scoring is not just bumped up by a constant for the higher team. Okay, so I think that you'd have to modify those probabilities in a way that is there is a reason why we observe that type of equilibrium. Okay, it could be also because of loss aversion, but I think a fairly plausible explanation is that the technology is such that when the teams are unequal in strength, it is optimal for the weaker team to defend and the stronger team to attack, even if the score is tied. Yeah, so we can look at that.
Anything else from participants? John Louis' hand is still up, but I assume that's from earlier on. If anyone else wants to ask a question, please do go ahead.
So if there are no questions, then I'm going to ask a question. And this is something that I guess my question was what part of the paper should be emphasized? So is it the first part, the finding of that I claim is loss aversion? It wouldn't be the first study that finds loss aversion in sports, or even specifically in soccer. I think it does it sort of more in a different way. And therefore, the title right now is loss aversion in teams. I thought it would maybe make sense to emphasize more a little bit part the team aspect, but maybe I sort of back down from that. And the alternative is instead, what if the focus should really be on the away goal rule and the design of contest, and loss aversion just happens to be an ingredient in this, and so it would be more of a sports economics paper rather than a general paper about behavioral biases. So happy to get feedback on that.
Thomas suddenly appeared. I don't know if that meant that he was trying to make contribution, or maybe his team is playing up.
No, it's
there he is.
I was trying to get my camera, but I need to do some more extra things now with my new computer. Yeah, I think it's a very good question, Daniele. I can see the away. So I was thinking, is there any sort of away rule equivalent anywhere? And one thing that sort of striking about it is, I guess, is that you get rewarded more for doing that slightly more difficult, I guess. Is to score against home advantage. So I don't know if that's an angle. But if you can't think of such a thing, then I would say that the story of the team level loss aversion is still the way to go, I would say. I don't know if others want to pinch in on this, but that would be my my thing.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I think it's interesting the way goal, but then you would want to think of, you know, what's is there anything, is that rule in somehow an example of a more general framing of rules that you can also have in other settings, but I'm not so sure. It's such a strange beast, if you want. So now we have another one.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. I'll take other questions. I see there's another hand up.
Yeah, I think Thomas has gone on to mute. So, Anwaisha, your hands up.
Yes. I'm not sure if you can. Yeah. Okay. I definitely enjoyed the second part more, like just as an audience, and like loss aversion and attack and defense. So I also work in contests, so that way, like the first part was more aligned with my own research interests, but I definitely enjoyed the second part more. With regard to the last comment, I think, so what you were mentioning at the beginning, right, that when the two teams tie and they go to the penalty shots, then it's kind of equal probability, but that is often not the case. Like even when we look at World Cup matches, like some teams are actually better, like they have higher chances, so everybody can kind of predict that, okay, if this goes to this state, then definitely this team is going to win. I can't remember, so I think in the last World Cup also, it was Vienna, sorry, Austria, and some other team, I don't remember exactly, but the match went very well, but then once it went to the tiebreaker, everyone was kind of sure that, okay, now it's definitely Austria who is going to win. So if you can somehow relate this rule to that kind of inequality, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loudly, but definitely the last part was very interesting.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole big debate about, you know, penalty kicks and, you know, whether some teams have an advantage and, you know, what is the outcome, what is the effect of shooting first and things like that. I don't rule out that there can be sort of some instances where, you know, perhaps you have a goalkeeper who's considered a super specialist at saving penalty kicks, or, you know, a team that historically has always lost on penalty kicks, and so they have this sort of, you know, psychological bias. England.
That is not the only thing, right? I mean, there are some teams who keep repeatedly practicing the.
No. I mean, I think it's a, you know, it's a reasonable assumption to assume that, you know, ex ante the probability of winning is, you know, 50% on aggregate. Even though it definitely could be the case that, you know, some teams would, you know, have more than 50% probability of winning on penalty kicks, or perhaps they have in terms of thinking about the strategy, maybe they have a 48% probability of winning on penalty kicks, but that's still higher than a whatever probability that they have if they try to play an open game in extra time, and therefore they would rather defend. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the theoretical model, allowing sort of a different probability of winning on penalty kicks would change perhaps sort of some of the magnitudes and the conditions under which you observe one equilibrium instead of the other. But I don't think it would change the core result and the core implication of the paper. But definitely worth thinking about it, and see whether maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it does change some things in a substantial way.
I think I'll chip in, Daniele, in the sense that the way my collaborations usually work is I provide the data and I allow my co-authors to make these kinds of more strategic decisions on the structure of the paper and so on. But one thing I might say is that over the period you're looking at, you can get more information on the individual matches. I don't know how much you've used, but I guess you've used the timing of all the goals and obviously whether the game was in extra time. But you can get information on the starting lineups and therefore the number of attacking defensive players, which might give you a sense of strategy. You can look at when changes were made and whether those were attacking or defensive changes, which might yield a little bit more insight perhaps into the coach versus team aspect of this team dynamic or individual dynamic with risk aversion.
Yep. Yes, I think it's it's feasible, at least for part of the period. I don't think that all the way going back to some sort of preliminary matches in 2009. Those are often less well-known teams than the ones that make it to the knockout stages. But yeah, we could look at that.
Any final questions and comments from the audience for Daniele? Well, I'll interpret that as a no, and I will thank Daniele for a fascinating presentation. Really interesting work. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, questions and comments. We now break for Easter, which is always exciting, and we return after Easter. And I've managed to close down my Word document that gives me the exact date, but I know that it's the 31st of April we return with our Hybrid Roses presentation, when Rob Simmons will be down here in Reading with us. So we'll work on the technical side of that between now and then. The first full week after Easter is the 22nd. Sorry, is that right? 22nd, 29th. So 21st is the Friday. So 28th must have been the next talk when Rob visits us. 21st, 22nd, there'll be a physical meeting, Burntrix 9th Western Football and Finance Conference, and hopefully I'll see many of you there. But otherwise, I wish you all a fantastic Easter and look forward to seeing you again in person and on Teams for future talks after Easter.
Thank you very much for all the comments.